Welcome to the Happy Mindset, episode number 99. Today's episode is called Deep Work and Being a Swot. So today I'm going to talk about this topic. It's because I've been reading the book Deep Work by Cal Newport. I started it there a few years ago, and I just picked it up again recently. I've been listening to it on Audible, and I really like it. It's gives you an insight into deep work, into what's distracting us today from deep work. It talks about social media and technology. It talks about just generally how we're being distracted and how the ability to work deeply is something that you practice and get good at. So what I like about this book is that Carl's approach is very nuanced. It's not very black and white. He's not saying that you should do this or should do that. He's giving advice contextually, and he's just giving examples. And he even talked about the craftsman was like a farmer. He talked about the haymaker. So he had a haymaker, and he was just going through his thought process basically of why he would choose one thing over the other. And the farmer's thought process was nuanced, and he was thinking ahead of time as well. So he wasn't just seeing something as if it had any benefit, he would take it on. He was looking at a lot more deeper than that. And so he was arguing, or he was just highlighting how we could bring this approach more to the knowledge economy. But what's stopping a lot of us from doing that is the way we approach things in general. Like when we look at social media, he was even, I think, applying it to the different platforms there are. So a lot of the time, because of fear of missing out, FOMO, we'll just pick something because there's some sort of benefit to it and it's popular, and we don't see the downsides to that. So for example, with social media, it's basically your attention. So in order to focus your attention on one thing, you have to sacrifice another thing. If you really think about it, think about the things you're actually sacrificing and whether it is worth it in the long run. So what I like about him again is that he's not saying social media is good or bad. He's giving a very nuanced depending on the context, depending on like what your goal is. So I like that about it. It's not very black and white. So what it got me thinking about though was this, I've just been thinking, I think I'm resonating with the book more now than I was a few years ago, because I guess with computer programming, it's helping me to think more deeply. Because that's what you have to do as a programmer. You do have to think about abstract concepts and you tie them together and make sense of them in your head, and as you move forward as well, there's always new problems and new challenges. So you never feel like you fully get there to the top of the mountain and you've everything sussed. There's always like a new challenge. If there isn't new challenges, then you're just not pushing yourself. That's the fact of the matter in programming. And he even mentioned in the book too, putting programming was one of those careers that require deep work. And so the title of this podcast, the SWOT part, ties into, I think that was that label itself and my fear of that label and what it meant, that put me off what I was inclined to do. Like even as an adult now, as I found myself reading more, as I found myself going to the coffee shops more, a lot of my struggle in my mind was actually around, what does this mean for me as a person? I just felt like an oddball because I didn't grow up in a culture where people talked about deep work, or people were encouraged to better themselves that way, like in a deeper, more meaningful way. So when I think about deep work, it's about, like, I guess what I'm doing with my podcast and what I'm doing with my writing and stuff. I'm thinking about things in order to make sense to my world, and that gives me more clarity, and it gives me more of a sense of direction in my life, and that for me is priceless. Initially when I started out, I thought that, like, in order to be engaging in social media and all these things, you needed to be selling something, or you needed to be selling something. And that was another obstacle for me as well to get over, that you can actually be on social media and create. So what I'm starting to think of my podcast and my Instagram account, I'm starting to think of it as more of like, it's a public place where I put my stuff. I put my thoughts. I make sense of things. So instead of just keeping all the stuff to myself, because I know that deep work isn't that common today. So I know that by putting it out there in the long term, I can add value to people. and even talking on this podcast about that was a big block for me. This SWOT label I'd kind of picked up on. It wasn't even the word itself. It was just a general sense of it being weird to want to study philosophy or psychology. But even when I was in the school and even when they had those terms, like, it's a different experience. So I'm trying to get at. It wasn't like school for me was like you're learning subjects. It wasn't actually a lot of the time, in my mind, irrelevant to my life, because I know a lot of the time you don't see the application of it, so you don't see the benefit to it. But I guess the transition for me was when I graduated from college and I went into the real world. I started seeing how learning applies to your life. So when I was in school, I had those narratives that I bought into around not wanting to be a SWAT or not wanting to be seen in a certain way. As I grow older and I get comfortable with who I am and what I want to do and what I'm actually interested in, genuinely, I found that those narratives don't make as much sense in my mind anymore. This could be down to maybe the work I've done over the years myself as well, psychologically. But even when those narratives could pop up, I just tend to ignore them, because I realize that those narratives are actually more painful to be in psychologically than to be in the present moment and actually do what you want to do. Another thing that I kind of picked up on from the book is that, like, deep work is a long-term process. As in, when I was doing stuff as well, I kind of had this urgency and I had this kind of, it has to be perfect daily and stuff, whereas I actually kind of believe that deep work is more about a long-term approach. So day by day you get ahead. So even with language learning as well, that's how I'd learn a language. It would be break it down, chunk it down into small manageable pieces and expect to make mistakes and to get some feedback, and that's how you go about perfecting the language. That's mastery in action. So that's what I'm learning as I go along with deep work. And with that understanding, it helps me to slow down more. And I think that ties into the deep work as well. When you're slowing down more in your head, you can focus on what's in front of you right now. So before, when I didn't have that understanding, I just felt this rush, this panic, and it wasn't logical. It was just something somewhere I picked up something, some sort of belief that rushing through things, or I guess it would have been the sense of needing that validation, I guess. And there's still elements of that for me today, but I notice it a bit more. And I guess my mindset is just shifting more from seeking the validation. It's gradually evolving from that more to just creating. And that's allowing me to just create more freely. That's why I've been bringing in more stuff like the language learning, computer programming, different stuff into my podcast and into my social channels, because I just feel more relaxed about it, because I'm starting to value deep work and value creating things that can have impact on people. So that's what it's always been about for me. But as I'm moving forward, this is kind of more of something that I'm internalizing more. My mindset is shifting more through the experience. So that's I'd recommend giving that a read, the deep work. I think Carl Newport. He seems to be a very thoughtful person. And he thinks, like the book title, he seems to think deeply about things. He seems to put in some forethought and consideration to things. And there's a lot of different experiments too you can run in those books too. And so that's what I wanted to talk about today. And tie that in with the SWOT thing as well. Like, when I talk about SWOT or any of that kind of stuff, it sounds trivial and it sounds babyish and stuff when I say it out. But in my mind, that was a huge issue. It wasn't exactly the word, it was the culture. It was the culture that was the issue. But then as well, I think there's a certain amount of growing through this stuff. Like, sometimes in life you need a contrast, so you don't know you have it good until you have it bad. You don't know that you're feeling alive until you feel numb to yourself. So those contrasts help as well. That's the way I kind of look at life, is that sometimes you need to go through the bad times as well. And in saying that, it wasn't like it was bad times, it was just a different phase of life. I guess that was probably what it was. It was like a different phase of life. But I've noticed that some people carry that mindset forward into their adult life and they never fully snap out of it. And I found it actually very difficult to snap out of it, but I've just been intentional, and I've been doing this for years now. So I'm gradually, slowly moving out of that mindset that had me trapped. So that's what I wanted to talk about today. To I guess to validate kind of if you might feel that it's trivial to acknowledge that. I think it was important for me anyway to acknowledge that did affect me, that culture affected me and how I saw the world. Because when you acknowledge it, when you're acknowledging it, then you're saying to yourself that isn't how the world is, and that wasn't a normal experience. Because if you don't acknowledge it, you'll just assume, well, this has been my experience, I just assume that that's the way the world is, that's the way all schools are, that's the way the education system is. And it probably could be for a lot of people, and that's why a lot of people picked it up and moved forward with life with that same mindset. But as an adult, you can choose to snap out of that by acknowledging that that's a mindset. That's a mindset you can grow from. So that's where the power is then, because you stop seeing it as life and you start seeing it as a mindset, and you can break out of that mindset and actually enjoy what you're doing. So it's all about finding the things that you enjoy doing. For me, it's doing this podcast, writing, it's coding, learning languages. I just love listening to different languages. I don't even speak a lot of French these days, but I listen online to YouTube videos, and I'll go on Netflix as well and watch some French stuff there, or Italian or Spanish. So I just like that because I put in so much effort into learning those languages that I like to keep it up. I like to just keep being some way immersed in those languages artificially. When it comes to language learning as well, when people say that if you don't use it, you lose it, I think you get rusty, but you don't fully lose it if you properly mastered it to begin with. Like I remember with French that I'd reached a level where it was flowing for me, as in like I could speak things and not really think about it. And so I mastered that pattern in the language. So that's not something I have to learn again. I might forget some words here and there, but I haven't forgotten the pattern of the language. I don't think I ever will. That's why I'm so big on pattern recognition. So yeah, that's when things stick, when you look at the pattern. So that's what I wanted to talk about today. So deep work and being a Swot. Basically, don't let things define you. Follow your own path in life. Define your own normal. These things aren't easy. I wish I could just snap my finger and say that it's just an easy thing. You just decide like that. From my experience, it's taken time, but it does also require that decision that like you've had enough of a certain way, and you're going to focus on a new direction. That would be my advice. So yeah, I guess what would be an actionable tip? An actionable tip would be to read Deep Work. Yeah, it's a good book, so I'd recommend giving that a read. So yeah, thanks for listening, and I will speak to you on the next episode.